First, Anyway, think about that.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing the morning with us. Lisa Ritchie, City of Louisville.
Good morning, Councilor.
And I'm just going to take a few minutes. We have some electeds and some of our city leadership. We're going to introduce folks after the panel for here who's in the room. But we just especially want to express our gratitude for these folks. They showed up. This is all volunteer. They worked really, really hard on all of your behalfs over the last week, talking to some of you, talking amongst themselves. And so they are here really just to kind of do an overview of the things that they've heard and help us set maybe a little bit of a few next steps that we haven't thought about. So we're going to turn it over to them and let's just thank them for their time. Take it away, Marianne.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning, and thank you so much for joining us. I'm Marianne Eppig. I'm the Director of Resilience for the Urban Land Institutes, and I've been staffing this advisory services panel. A few quick announcements before we get started. We are recording this, so it's available for viewing later as well. We ask that you please silence your phones if that's an option for you. And we have some handouts for everybody right outside the door if you'd like to grab those. This, like Lisa said, has been a volunteer experience for our wonderful panelists. This is our 4th day and the final presentation of our findings and recommendations. We will also be producing a report after this. It'll take us about 3 months to produce that report, and then the cities of Louisville and the town of Superior will have that report afterwards. And they can decide what to do with it, so we hope that it's useful. Jumping in. The Urban Land Institute is a global nonprofit that is dedicated to making a difference in people's lives through member impact on the built world. Our members include land use professionals of all stripes and across sectors. The mission of the Urban Land Institute is to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities worldwide. We do this by connecting, inspiring, and leading. I utilize Urban Resilience Program, which is focused on how buildings, cities, and communities can be more resilient to the impacts of climate change and other environmental vulnerability. And this advisory service program is part of the Resilient Land Use Cohort, which is a national technical assistance and knowledge sharing network for communities across the country that are working on local climate adaptation and resilience efforts. Just to give you some background on ULI's advisory services program. ULI has helped more than 700 communities around the world find independent, strategic, and practical solutions for the most challenging land use issues since 1947. We select panelists based on their expertise and experience that are relevant to the questions posed by the sponsors. And with that, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, the city of Louisville and the town of Superior, who have dedicated an enormous amount of staff time to this effort, and to our funders, JPMorgan Chase and the Department of Local Affairs. So huge thank you to you for supporting this program. And with that, I'll turn it over to our panel chair, Peter Pollock, who will introduce the panel's scope of work.
Good morning, everyone. I've had the pleasure of chairing this panel, trying to keep them in line a little bit. Hopefully that's reflected in our presentation. But as was mentioned, the framing of this panel and its work starts with questions that come from our sponsors. Let me review them really quickly. First one was how we should apply the lessons of the Marshall Fire to inform the development of recovery and resiliency plans to help us face future risk. Secondly, to talk about the best practices for the management of the wildland urban interface, our favorite acronym, WUI. 3, how can we address short and long-term needs with a focus on housing affordability? And 4, how do we best engage with the community, both near and long term, on issues related to recovery and on important long-range decisions about our future? Closer on the microphone.
Online folks. Sorry.
Oh, the online folks are saying, can't hear him.
Thank you.
Okay. So I see many familiar faces in this audience. It's partly because we had a day full of information coming from a variety of stakeholders. So we spent a very intense day interviewing stakeholders. So thank you to all of you for sharing your viewpoints about issues I just mentioned, the challenges and opportunities ahead, and your vision of what success looks like. I have to say the experience of sitting with 11 different groups over 8 hours felt a little like speed dating at times, but it, along with the briefing report we received, a tour of the communities, helped form a solid base of information with which to shape our findings and recommendations. So thank you to all of you who gave of your time. That was really appreciated. I want to get this panel in the room here and talk about their backgrounds. I'm a city planner. I'm a 45-year resident of the Boulder Valley. Worked for about 25 years for that big kahuna in the county, Boulder, Colorado.
Hi, I'm Kimball Krangle. I'm an affordable and workforce housing developer located here in the state of Colorado, working in the Front Range and up in the mountains. I'm here to just provide a little perspective on what affordable housing is and what kinds of housing may be appropriate for Louisville and Superior. Thanks for having me.
Good morning, I'm Dan, I'm a principal with Economic and Planning Systems. We're an economic consulting firm. I'm based here in Denver. And I've got a fair amount of experience working for both communities as well as others along the U.S. border on market and economic revitalization and redevelopment projects.
Good morning, I'm Claire Hartman, I'm from Santa Rosa, California. I worked for the city of Santa Rosa for 25 years, mostly in planning. Currently, I'm the director of planning and economic development. And I'm here because unfortunately, I also have experience with wildfire erosion in our city.
Good morning. My name is Amy Lavin. I'm a principal with Economic and Planning Systems. I'm based in Sacramento, California. I am here participating on this panel, which I really appreciate the opportunity to give my perspective on the questions posed by the communities. I'm here because I assisted the town of Paradise and the surrounding communities related to the Camp Fire. And then I also have assisted a number of jurisdictions in California developing comprehensive housing strategies. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Molly Mowry. I am the executive director of a nonprofit called the Community Wildfire Planning Center. I am based here in Littleton, Colorado, although we work across the country, primarily the Western US, to assist organizations, local governments, state governments, federal agencies, and other entities on providing technical assistance directly related to the wildland urban interface, including addressing pre and post-fire activities. Thanks.
Good morning, I'm Victoria Simonson. I'm the town administrator of Lyons, Colorado, located here in Boulder County. And I was responsible for managing our town's recovery from the 2013 floods. And I am sharing our hindsight and lessons learned with the ASPC this week.
Good morning, my name is Darcy White with Berry Associates. I am based in Denver, Colorado, but my role on this panel is really bringing my background working with the town of Superior and city of Louisville over the years, but also with a lot of other communities along the Front Range who have been through the recovery and rebuilding process and are kind of looking ahead in terms of their plans and policies.
Great, thanks, panel. Also want to point out that on the right-hand side of that slide, you can see a whole host of folks from Urban Land Institute, or Marianne and her team. We went to great lengths to make us look good today, so really appreciate all of that. So we do want to provide a little bit of a context for this as we move forward, but just as a clue, we're going to do a series of presentations here. You're going to hear from us about sort of what we heard, how that factors into our individual areas, and some recommendations that come out of that. We're going to have, sounds like ample time for Q&A and discussions and that kind of stuff, but I'd ask you to hold that to the end. So let's start with this bigger picture. So starting with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land we are discussing is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. We honor and respect the people of these nations and their ancestors. So we offer up this acknowledgement to the tribes who inhabited this place well before European settlement began. In fact, sort of close to where I live, they uncovered a Clovis culture stone tool cache that was dated to 13,000 years ago. So just in terms of timeframes, thinking about how people have been on this land and used it, I think is a useful reflection. These people lived on the land in a much different way than we do now, and they moved with the seasons to meet their needs instead of creating these kinds of settlements. So, speaking of settlement, Louisville and Superior both have their origins as mining and railroad towns and were incorporated in 1882 and 1904 respectively. Both communities experienced dramatic growth in the latter part of the 1900s, significantly expanding beyond their original boundaries. So these historic beginnings are part of the heart and soul of the community. And as William Faulkner said, the past is never dead. It's not even past. So this is really, this origin story is still with us. So we're meeting you at an extraordinary time in your history as you focus on recovering and rebuilding from the Marshall Fire. We acknowledge that the community, most especially those who have had losses, are still grieving. Things will never be the same, but they will get better as time passes. We see a very impressive amount of rebuilding and investment. Our intent is not to be disrespectful of the current process of healing and recovery. We are here to share our experience with past recovery projects and look forward to addressing and preparing for the future. So part of that future, unfortunately, is the effects of climate change itself. And key message here is that it's here to stay. But John Holdren's insight here that we basically have three choices: mitigation, adaptation, and suffering. We're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be. The more mitigation we do, the less adaptation will be required, and the less suffering there will be. And so as we work hard on recovering from the suffering and upping our game on adaptation and resilience, we can't forget the need to continue to work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and lessen the impact of climate change itself. Also, unfortunately, climate change is increasing in intensity. This chart shows the number and cost of significant disaster events over time. The picture is not good. Disaster events also seem to be increasing in intensity and duration. We have heard that there's no longer a wildfire season, that is a year-round thing. All right. The other thing we wanted to emphasize in this context setting was that climate change will present itself in a variety of different ways. And that we're going to have to really prepare ourselves for a variety of risks that we could face. It's not going to be one set of solutions that deal with all these risks, but a wide variety of measures that may be required. So while there's this intense focus obviously on wildfire and the event we just go through, this could present itself in lots of different ways in terms of the challenges ahead for recovery. So part of our process here is to take all that input that I mentioned and to come up with findings. At this point, what we really have is a set of observations about the challenges and opportunities that you all faced. A lot of that came from the stakeholder kind of feedback. So what I want to say about this at this point is our focus really is on learning from the recovery efforts to date, but not to relitigate them. So this is not an examination of what happened when and who did it and all that kind of stuff. Our aim is really to show a path forward in the areas of recovery and resilience planning, managing the WUI, and creating housing diversity. And we also have a unique opportunity for the panel here, hear directly from another city, Santa Rosa, California, about having gone through a very similar event. So you can look at a case here as well. So I'm just going to flash these up here. We did hear a set of challenges and a whole set of opportunities. This presentation itself is going to be available, so you can look at some of the detail here of what we heard. But our focus really wants to move now onto the set of recommendations in the key areas that were identified by the towns. And with that. Didn't do bad. Here we go.
Good morning. No two disasters are the same. People do not experience them in the same way or within the same time frame. The Marshall Fire was very different from the Lions flood, but we can all learn from our experiences to better prepare for the next event. This is a graph that you might be familiar with from the National Disaster Recovery Framework. It's called the Recovery Continuum. It's been developed over years of disasters and defines the different phases of recovery and the activities you can anticipate in each phase. You individually can determine where you are on the spectrum. Your communities have been in an intense response and short-term recovery mode. It has taken its emotional and physical toll on each of you. I can see it in your eyes. Recognize and acknowledge that the full recovery is going to take years. It will take perseverance and patience. Lions had planned for a 4-year recovery. It ended up taking us 9 years due to funding, bureaucracy, staff, and work turnover. You guys have done an amazing job and the amount of work you've gotten done in the last 15 months. But you need to be sure and pace yourself and not burn out your leadership and your staff or your residents, because the continuity of knowledge and operations is critical to moving forward in a resilient, comprehensive manner. The trauma from an event such as yours is also different for each person. However, in general, it also follows a pattern. And I know some of the communities are familiar with this, but I find it useful in reminding me that the psychological recovery can also take years. Following an event, there's a period of heroism where response and rescue is occurring. It is followed by a honeymoon period where the community comes together, neighbors support neighbors, and people are cooperative in responding to the disaster. But as people take inventory of the situation, reality sets in on the magnitude of issues, the financial impact, and the rocky road to rebuilding. The low point in recovery is the feeling of disappointment when you realize that recovery is not going as fast or as well as you thought it would. This is often around the anniversary of an event when people are reflecting on their accomplishments and what is yet to be done. Recovery itself is a long road, definitely a marathon, not a sprint, and not for the faint of heart. It will be filled with ups and downs, small wins, and occasional setbacks, all the while making incremental progress toward your goal. Keep your eye on the big picture and support one another along that journey. Way to go. So what is resilience? Hearing that term. The state of Colorado defines it as the ability of communities to rebound, positively adapt to, or thrive amidst changing conditions or challenges, including human-caused and natural disasters, and to maintain quality of life, healthy growth, durable systems, economic vitality, and conservation of resources for present and future generations. Each community must identify its own risks and hazards and its vision for the future to design a resiliency plan that addresses its own unique social, economic, and natural environments. However, there is no reason you have to recreate the wheel. The Colorado Recovery and Resiliency Office has a multitude of resources, guides, and toolkits to assist you on your resiliency journey. This is just a sampling of documents that are readily available to get you started. All of these have been developed over just the past few years, so they're all current. And they've been developed by other communities that have experienced disasters and the leaders that led those. And you should not hesitate, staff should not hesitate to contact Ann or Chris LeMay at DOLA with your inquiries and ask for assistance in navigating this new realm we're living in.
So one of the things that we heard through our interviews is just a lot of. One of the things we heard through our interviews was just a lot of kind of an uneven level of understanding and perspectives on what's being done, how quickly it's being done, who's doing it, and how all those pieces fit together. And so this slide really just highlights some of the things that we're aware of that are already underway. And I think we heard both perspective of people are moving too fast, people are moving too slow. And so I think the point here is just, hang tight. As Victoria said, there are a lot of, this is a long stretch. And so there are efforts underway on a lot of the issues that we talked with folks about that, are going to be important for long-term recovery. And so some of those things are things that the city and town will be leading, such as their housing strategies, potentially looking at their comprehensive plans, related to the wildfire. There's a lot of different efforts that are underway. There are also a lot of folks in the two communities that are participating with Boulder County and others regionally and also nationally in thinking about best practices and how to kind of document what happened, what worked well, and plan for future events, God forbid, that when that happens. We also wanted to highlight there are a lot of conversations happening at the state level. A lot of these pertain to issues that some of you brought up and are concerned about. They've been themes throughout this fire and recovery. Those are not things we're able to kind of solve today, but I think wanted to acknowledge that those conversations are ongoing and having these organizations kind of participating in those conversations will be important moving forward. So one of our first recommendations really kind of pertains to planning, and we were asked to take a look at and kind of think about, how having guidance, better guidance before the disaster would have helped, and kind of how do you think about that moving forward in terms of what's helpful. We heard very loud and clear that in the near term, the focus needs to be on recovery. We agree with that. Absolutely, that is the focus. However, you'll hear one of the key takeaways we had in our conversations over this week from the folks who've been through this is that having a long-term vision for the future and a broader community conversation about the future is just as important as recovery. And so balancing those different things is going to be important. And the timing of, kind of how that plays out in each community is really going to be driven by you. But we think we want to highlight that needs to be part of the process of kind of moving forward. And we also see that, the mechanisms you have in process in terms of your plans and policies to facilitate some of those conversations are really ripe with opportunity. Having a broader conversation about how we can be more resilient and more sustainable in the future. The time is right to do that. It's fresh on everyone's mind. What can we be doing? What should we be doing? You need to have those conversations very candidly, now as part of your recovery and long-term future. And thinking about the potential what ifs as part of that process is going to be easier now and taken more seriously now than it might be kind of in a calm year. So we think that is a big opportunity for the future, but also to engage the broader community that has been supporting and the recovery efforts and re-engaging them in the long-term vision. So Victoria mentioned there's a lot of resources out there. I just want to focus on the Colorado Resiliency Framework. I think there's a lot of work that's been done in terms of thinking about how these issues kind of play into different types of communities, what you should be thinking about. A lot of these issues that came out of that framework really were a focus of our energy this week. And there are also a lot of other communities along the Front Range who have recovered from fire, flood, in addition to Alliance, Longmont, Manitou Springs, both put together kind of broader, resiliency frameworks in the form of either an integrated community plan and hazard mitigation plan in Manitou's case, or a comprehensive plan with a real focus on resiliency in Longmont's case. There's a lot of different ways to do this, and it's really up to you guys to think about, what is the vehicle for that, and kind of what do we want our focus to be, and how do we use that, not just for the planning folks in the room, but for our emergency managers, our public works folks, all of the folks who really on, kind of the front lines in terms of responding and recovering in this disaster. So our second recommendation goes back to something that Victoria touched on, and that is that the human capacity in kind of the long term is critical. And we've heard a lot of folks in this room who express real concern and kind of frustration of just how do we keep the knowledge that we've all gained over the last 15 months. We had to get up to speed really quickly. We weren't prepared, kind of emotionally and kind of skill wise to be able to respond to the things that we're responding to. And I know there's been a lot of effort put into support and kind of those things, but I think a couple key things that stood out to us. One is that at a regional level, there really is an opportunity to formalize and kind of think ahead for the next event, whether it's you guys or someone, one of your next door neighbors. How do we kind of capture that and formalize some of the arrangements that were made, ideally through an organization like Boulder County, who has broader resources and the ability to kind of house a lot of those things. So that deals with staffing, training, all of those types of things. And at the local level, also to Victoria's point, I think thinking about recovery as a long-term deal. You have kind of both communities have recovery managers that have been working in that capacity over the last year. I think Victoria had a staff person dedicated to that, even through the end of last year. And so the need to go pursue grants and kind of do all these things doesn't stop. And so we really think acknowledging that and kind of committing the resources to providing that support within your teams is critical.
Resiliency recommendation number 3 has to do with your infrastructure. We heard from your critical employees about the challenges they faced during the emergency response and the impacts that had on your infrastructure. Their efforts were not only heroic, but also very creative and award-winning, I believe. So we want to thank them for their service and their commitment to the public, and make some recommendations here as well in preparation for a future disaster. Resiliency, however, does not come without a cost. Funding is critical to implement resilience and recovery measures in your communities. The staff has been working so diligently to obtain federal and state funds. I want to acknowledge that it is often very frustrating and unfruitful, but it should not be abandoned. You may want to consider dedicated personnel for grant writing and grant management, especially for your longer term mitigation projects. Your current staff do not have the capacity to handle that themselves. The town of Lyons was able to leverage our small $1.3 million general funds into successfully implementing $75 million of projects in our recovery. So it can be done, but it takes work and it takes someone dedicated to it. And while allocating your general funds and your enterprise funds is an option for funding projects, oftentimes it is not enough to cover the entire cost of what needs to be done. There are many grants, loans, tax credits, and other resources available to communities in Colorado. And once again, the Colorado Resiliency and Recovery Office's website, this is a snippet from it, has an interactive guide to local funding. And they have also fire-specific resources on the wildfire recovery page. You also have several neighboring municipalities, as well as Boulder County, who are well-versed and able to assist in maneuvering through these myriad of funding sources.
Hey, thanks, Victoria and Darcy. And thank you all for the opportunity to be here and welcoming us to discuss these important topics. We're going to switch gears now to talk about the wildland urban interface and best practices. I want to start out just by sharing a couple key themes that we heard specifically related to wildfire and the WUI this week from stakeholders. So these include the theme of fires will happen again. Fire, we know, is already part of the ecosystem here and will continue to occur. And as Peter talked about, climate change will continue to throw us curveballs and extreme events. We also heard a continued sense of vulnerability and concern over how some rebuilding is already occurring without any requirements for the WUI, which will continue or contribute to future wildfire risk. We heard a desire for authoritative guidance and direction as well. Many stakeholders expressed interest in receiving more information on WUI construction and landscaping requirements. And finally, we heard different perspectives on where the WUI is, what caused the fire to spread, was it weather, open space, unmitigated homes, fences, etc. So I'm just going to start by addressing this last piece. The combination of many elements in the wildland urban interface is what contributes to a wildfire disaster. Now, the WUI is not restricted to a specific type of vegetation, such as only trees, or a certain topography, such as only mountains. What really matters for understanding the WUI risk is how homes, trees, landscaping, shrubs, fences, and other fuels are built, arranged, managed, and whether these fuels can sustain a fire once that fire transitions from the wildlands or grasslands into an urban area. So when we think about the WUI, we need to think about any developed area that has these conditions present to sustain the fire, which could be in rural settings, suburban, residential, or urban. Well, just want to also touch on that grasslands, the idea of a grassland WUI are not unique to Colorado. I've been working with WUI communities across the US and Canada for more than 15 years. These are just a few examples of other communities where we've worked in Washington, California, Oregon, where grasslands were responsible for a fire that transitioned from the wildlands into an urban setting. So one of the questions we were asked this week is, what are WUI best practices for for both communities, Superior and Louisville? You have a handout that I'll be referring to, hopefully if you picked it up. But the overarching best practice is to take a comprehensive fire-adapted communities approach. Fire-adapted community is simply a community that recognizes its risk, takes actions to become more prepared and adapted to the next fire. Being fire adapted also means that communities look at a number of different strategies that relate to pre-fire planning on multiple scales, coordinating an efficient and safe response, and looking at successful recovery in advance of the next fire. But there is no endpoint for becoming fire adapted. It's really living with and adapting to fire as a way of life. We like to say the more actions you take, the more fire adapted you become. And the good news is there's several key actions that we talked about already being taken by the town and city for increasing community fire adaptation. One of them relates to landscape treatments. Darcy mentioned the Grasslands Working Group and the city's wildfire mitigation plan for city-owned properties is moving forward. Obviously, a lot of recovery work, especially through the good, I should say fantastic work of the town and city's recovery managers. We know there are we know the clicker's not working. Thank you. We know there's several community wildfire protection plan updates in place being undertaken by the county and Mountain View Fire Rescue. And finally, we heard a lot about the excellent neighborhood level organization and partnerships and community engagement. But there's always a but. There are some key things that are missing from the FAC, the Fire Adapted Communities Wheel. And we recommend 3 immediate and medium-term strategies to help address some of these missing pieces. We also heard earlier this week from the elected officials, they wanted practical and pragmatic and realistic recommendations. So that's also the goal with these 3 recommendations. First one, as you can see, is focused on the town and city to develop a comprehensive educational program. WUI resilience is a shared responsibility. Everyone has a role. This program really recognizes that although we heard there, let me go back, I think that moved forward too quickly. Thank you. We heard this week about a lot of excellent educational and outreach strategies already being undertaken, but our takeaway was that wasn't really formalized into a program, especially a program that could allow for ongoing efforts. These are just the applicability are a few examples of where opportunities exist. For example, coordination at the resident level on something like the formalized Firewise Communities USA program. Also opportunities, and this exists in other communities too. This isn't unique specifically to what we see here, but we see ongoing needs for the development community and building community architects and landscape architects to learn more about what reconstruction methods are appropriate, or what landscaping plan templates or master gardening classes could be beneficial. In terms of implementation, a lot of this, particularly with education, can be coordinated through the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. Many of you are likely aware of that already. There's also other opportunities to expand the local education of residents. For example, Boulder County Wildfire Partners Program could be an opportunity for home assessment programs. I will say from personal experience, I was one of the first cadre of the Boulder County Wildfire Partners assessment specialists, and it was really a fantastic program. If there's an opportunity and a welcome approach for that here. We recommend this as an immediate and ongoing priority. So this, again, with fire adaptation, there's no endpoint. This is something that could be undertaken in the immediate term. Second recommendation is for the town and city to each adopt a WUI vegetation management ordinance that applies across jurisdictional boundaries, i.e. the entire WUI, on private property. So the intent of this is to reduce potential fire spread from landscaping to homes by removing many of those fuels that help sustain a fire throughout the WUI. This ordinance would address what's in the first 5 feet closest to a home to provide a non-combustible or ember-resistant zone. That would include no flammable materials such as mulch or shredded bark, combustible fences, or hedges. More broadly, this would also apply to parcels that are large with larger lots. So within the first 30 feet, would minimize trees, shrubs, and other vegetation, including prohibiting specific highly flammable species such as juniper. This would not be intended to be retroactive. I think there was some initial confusion when some of these were discussed as potential strategies. It's not intended to be retroactive. It would not require everyone in the town or city to remove all existing trees and fences. It would apply once the ordinance is effective to landscaping plans moving forward following the effective date of the ordinance. A couple just items here to help with implementation. The items such as allowable or prohibited plant species could be informed by experts in the grasslands working group and other local experts. Our advice is to work on getting this ordinance in place now. Now meaning start working on it now for vegetation management before landscape plans for rebuilds are approved and planting begins. So with an ideal adoption date by the end of this year. I included 2 examples here from communities we've worked with in California. I know they're in California, but they are fantastic examples for this particular ordinance. The city of Malibu and Napa County both adopted landscape and fire protection requirements for that ember resistant zone. Both were post-fire situations. Both had excellent adoption and implementation strategies associated with them. So offer those 2. There's many more. In fact, there are many here in Colorado that have adopted similar provisions. Okay. Final 3rd recommendation is we recommend to the extent practical. Excuse me, let me back up. The 3rd and final recommendation is for both the town and city to each adopt WUI building and construction ordinance to increase protection from embers, radiant heat, and direct flame contact. This ordinance would apply to future new construction, remodels, and additions, not retroactively or commercial fire affected properties. We recommend that to the extent practical, these WUI building design and construction requirements would align with Boulder County's updated requirements for the eastern portion of the county for consistency across jurisdictions. We also recommend working on this following the adoption of a vegetation management ordinance, just to be realistic in terms of what's the focus now, what's the future focus. Another key resource is a recent report that our organization actually released in the fall called Regulating the Wildland Urban Interface. This profiled 3 case studies from Colorado Springs, Eagle County, and Uray County, and looked at the regulatory process that they adopted, as well as the implementation tips and strategies associated with those efforts. Side note, because this did come up and has come up a lot this week, people have asked about, what the state is doing. There is proposed state legislation for adopting ultimately what would be a statewide WUI code. My recommendation is not to wait for that. What's proposed right now in the legislation is the establishment of a wildfire resiliency code board. So this bill would establish a 24-person appointed board to first define the WUI and identify areas of the state that would be required to then adopt minimum codes and standards for structures in defensible space. That may take a while, and I think the recommendation is not to wait for the state action. Do what's best for your community and within the time frame possible. Final quick, just want to recognize there are immediate, and when I say immediate, I do mean immediate, immediate funding opportunities and midterm funding opportunities to support these 3 recommended priorities. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into details through each of these, only to say that there are state and federal funds for each of these activities that we recommended here. So these are very achievable. Funding includes staffing and capacity building, ignition resistant construction and building code improvements, and implementation of defensible space. The first one highlighted in bold is a state mitigation programs, wildfire mitigation incentives for local governments for grants. And that is due April 5th, but I would say there is still time if you're not familiar with that. They are very supportive of capacity building projects that also provide local governments with resources and staffing necessary to plan and implement these type of wildfire mitigation efforts. Thanks again for your time. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this really important topic.
Ms. Molly. Good morning. As part of the panel, the community's posed questions related to understanding short and long-term impacts to the local housing market and steps that the communities could take to address any negative impacts to housing. To address these questions, we wanted to document existing housing conditions and input we received from stakeholders, discuss housing affordability in the communities, and then present our recommendations for next steps. The communities in Louisville and Superior lost nearly 950 housing units in the fire, as you all are well aware. That represented about 7% of the community's total housing stock, although Superior lost a larger proportion of their housing stock. Most of the housing loss was single-family homes at 95%, with the remaining 5% representing multifamily homes. Importantly, much of the housing loss in some of the neighborhoods in Superior represented some of the most affordable single-family homes in the communities. The impact of losing so much housing in an already constrained housing market resulted in a variety of socioeconomic outcomes, including rising housing costs, displacement of the most vulnerable populations, and likely other outcomes such as impacts on the labor supply for businesses. But despite a range of challenges, including navigating underinsurance, high construction costs, funding deficiencies, and continuing to manage the trauma of the event, it's encouraging to see that many in both communities are in the process of rebuilding. And as of a month ago, per the data shown on this slide, about 40% of homes lost have been issued building permits to rebuild. We wanted to also document steps that the communities have taken to diversify the housing stock. Both communities have adopted the Boulder County Regional Housing Plan in December 2017, with a goal of providing 12% of rental and ownership housing as permanently affordable to low and middle income households by 2035. In addition, both communities in 2021 adopted inclusionary housing ordinances, which require a certain percentage of new residential development to be affordable to below area median income households. And although not adopted, it's important to mention that both communities are on the precipice of beginning housing plans that will define the housing needs of the community and identify strategies to address those needs. So we heard a lot from a lot of stakeholders, as others have mentioned, and some of our key findings related to the housing topic include the perception that municipalities are built out, and annexation opportunities are limiting the opportunity for new housing. As I mentioned before, homes lost in original Superior represented some of the most naturally occurring affordable housing. The limited housing availability from the loss of housing has spurred rental price gouging, and rental housing needs overall have largely been ignored. ADUs and housing density need to be considered across both communities and not just in one or two specific neighborhoods. However, the community does believe, or there's a perception there that higher density housing is a fiscal drain on the city's operating budgets. Lack of data on socioeconomic characteristics of displaced households means that identifying the needs of that population is really difficult to understand. And then underinsurance was a big issue and has exacerbated the rebuild process. And then lastly, without a comprehensive housing strategy that identifies areas for additional density, rezoning, developer incentives, and other tools, the communities will not meet the housing goals that I covered earlier in the adopted policies.
So we just wanted to take a minute to take a step back and talk about what is affordable housing. It's a very vague term unless we dig down and really understand what that means. So we wanted to just localize this a little bit and talk about, you know, if you have a teacher in the local school district, that starting salary is about $50,000 a year, trending up towards $60,000 a year. If you're a 1 or 2 person household with that single income earner, you're at about a 60% of area median income. That's a HUD definition that's published annually. Whereas if you maybe work for a local police and fire department, that average salary may be $60,000 to $70,000. Now, if you have 2 teachers working in one or living in one housing unit, you know, that's 50,000 times 2. You're at about 100% of area median income. And when we start talking about who's working in Louisville and who's working in Superior, what can they afford to either rent or purchase if they haven't lived here for a long time? Because that is what makes up the fabric of the community. And the communities being so longstanding that they have been and being very special places, you know, it would be great if your grandkids, for example, could afford to live in the same community that you do, or that your grandkids' teachers are somebody you see at the local supermarket on a Saturday, or that your adult children can afford to move back home or move out of your house into something that they can pay for themselves. And so we talk a lot about like very low income, which is typically 30 to 60% of area median income, workforce housing, which is along that spectrum, 80 to 120% of area median income. And then market rate housing. And a healthy community, we know, offers a different type of mix of housing so that people can live there wherever they are along the income spectrum. It's affordable relative to them and their specific household need. And that can be for rent, it can be for sale. Oops. You know, 2020 data is, 2020 feels like a long time ago, pre-COVID, pre-fire. We know prices have gone up since then, but at that time, which is the best data we have kind of as a snapshot, we saw that median sales prices in the communities here were about $700,000 a year. You would be needing to earn 190% of the area median income to purchase that home. Similarly, a rent level is just under 100% AMI. And so one thing to consider that may be appropriate for these communities is to talk about this missing middle typology, or what's between a single family home structure and a 500 unit apartment structure. There's a whole lot of gray area in between those that can represent opportunities to add more affordable housing, either by design, meaning they're smaller homes, so they're a little cheaper, or through formal policy that offers deed restrictions to keep that affordability intact. And this is just an example of how different units, duplex, townhome, condos may be more affordable along the spectrum. And then we were intrigued by the weed cottages that we saw in Superior, and noticed that, you know, as an example of one of the more affordable homes for sale right now at $625,000, if you were to try to buy that 2-bedroom home for $625,000, you'd need to make $170,000 a year. That is not very affordable. I just feel like I need to point that out. It would be really hard for a lot of folks that have been in town for a long time to be able to afford that at that price. And so it's just really important to be able to say what's going on with affordability.
So Andy mentioned that making the community perceive it as being built out. But there really are opportunities for additional housing if the community is willing to undertake the strategies and changes to provide that housing in different locations. The two primary strategies are looking at the redevelopment of outmoded commercial properties within the community, that being vacant commercial boxes and outmoded commercial on arterial corridors. One of the potential boxes now is those, but there will be others. The community in the adjacent area is really over retail, regional retail, so there will continue to be some mortality in the big box retail arena. The Superior Marketplace is a location where housing can be introduced. The owner, Brixmore, is open to the opportunity to be providing some housing on some of the vacant commercial in the site. Some additional residential in there will help reinforce the viability of that shopping center going forward and be able to maintain, you know, the important tax base that's located at that location that's providing the majority of revenue for the town of Superior from Target, Costco, and Whole Foods. And certainly the adjacent RTE property is another location. There are other vacant sites within the community that could potentially be rezoned. It may require rezoning, it may require comprehensive plan changes to allow for additional housing, but certainly the Saharia's property, there are vacant residential sites and vacant industrial land that's probably not suited for industrial in the original Superior area. And even the largest undeveloped site in the community, Red Tail Ridge property, the former storage tech site, is 400 acres, which doesn't allow for residential right now, but is a potential opportunity that could be introduced there. The I guess it's correct. So there was, we identified a number of the strategies for providing affordable housing in the community. Certainly looking at, additional density and lot splitting is one of the opportunities where residential can be provided in locations where it doesn't impact surrounding neighborhoods, significantly. The example shown here is there's a vacant industrial parcel in original Superior that is for sale for $4 million. It's 6 lots. And if those properties were densified to allow, if they were split to allow 3,500 foot lots instead of 7,000 foot lots, you could get 12 units. And because ADUs are allowed, you could get a 12 additional accessory dwelling units in there and really provide a significant amount of affordable housing on one site. And then in terms of trying to reach the price, one of the price points for that affordable housing, modular homes would be around 350,000 on those units, just at around 95% of area income. And the ADUs would be around 200,000, reaching a little lower point rate at 80% of area income. In terms of just trying to summarize what we have provided, the three of us have provided in terms of the affordable housing recommendations. The short-term recommendations for the next 1 to 2 years, we were recommending both communities complete the housing plans that we've discussed here that are underway, that are RFPs are out for right now, and adopt a range of strategies to allow for additional housing density and additional housing across the range of affordable housing categories. We think that both communities should consider adopting a citywide or community-wide ADU ordinance. This requires in some locations working with the HOAs, but we think this could consider both units on the rear of the site, but also interior ADUs within units. It's been mentioned that communities that we recommend building the housing expertise in the two communities through a housing staffer or some other type of system, because I think this is going to be an ongoing effort over the next 3 to 5 years. And then in terms of utilizing the rebuilding efforts both within the urban areas and other areas in the community, come up with promoting the development community to build more housing, more diverse housing, more affordable housing, using financial incentives and using state and local resources to provide those financial incentives to develop. Amy mentioned that there's a lack of socioeconomic data on the affected population in the burn area, the ongoing Marshall fire, the ongoing Marshall fire survey that is currently going on is providing that information, and that data should be available very shortly. But it's a very professionally well conducted survey about all of the fire data pre and post fire from affected populations. And then finally, in terms of perhaps a little longer term recommendations, but much of it will be incorporated into the housing studies and the upcoming comp plan redos that are taking place. Consider that range of housing strategies that we've outlined and discussed here to provide a greater range of housing products across the affordable housing spectrum. And then finally, working with the county to implement a rental housing voucher problem, because I I think, as Danny mentioned earlier, the rental population is really been, it hasn't been adequately addressed in terms of what the needs are for additional rental housing. Please.
Thanks, Dan. Yeah, we're gonna, switch gears a little bit. I have an opportunity to tell our story. I've been in the trenches just like you and 5 years post at that time. So I wanted to share some of the experiences that we went through, how we approached it. And while, Santa Rosa is in a different state and is a much bigger scale, I'm hoping that you find some of our lessons are relevant and scalable. So Santa Rosa is an hour north of San Francisco. And we have a population of 175,000. So we're the largest city between the Golden Gate Bridge and Portland. We're unique in that way. And half of our community are homeowners, which means the other half are renters. So that's something that we work with. And we are mostly white, but we have a strong contingent of Hispanic and other ethnicities. So my reality changed, even though I grew up in the area and I had been planning for the city of Santa Rosa for 20 years at the time of the 2017 Tubbs fire. We did have a planned area called the Very High Fire Severity Zone. We always hope that stays as just a in plan, but it became a reality and we learned quite a bit from that. So the blue area on the map is where the Tubbs area came in and yes, touched the high fire severity zone, but also jumped the 6-lane highway, Highway 101, and then went into our workforce housing neighborhood that we call Coffee Park. It also got to the other side of our community, as you see over there, and that other area is a senior community. It was the first one in many years in my life, and only just a couple of years later, we experienced another fire that did encroach into our city limits called the Glass Fire. With the Tubbs fire, we lost 3,000 homes, 3,000 units in one night. That's 5% of our housing stock. We also lost 3 hotels. And we learned as time went on what else we lost in terms of what was in the community. In the Glass Fire, a couple of years later, we had gotten much better with communications and regional partnerships. We lost 35 homes, but also terrible to go through. And in between these experiences, there were other wildfire threats. Luckily, they didn't come into our city limits, but as you can see here, it did become our new normal. So 2017 wasn't a one-off. We did really need to start thinking about resiliency in everything we do. And it is surrounding our community. The darker green here is where the traditional wildfires took place. And all the other colors are more recent wildfires. So we've had a lot of evacuations and then real attacks. So before the Tubbs fire in 2016, we had a housing supply and affordability crisis. We were not able to keep our community intact. People were being displaced because of just couldn't find a place to rent. And then if they could find it, they were struggling with affording it. So this chart shows that as we were clipping along in our regular housing policies, we were achieving about 300 units per year before the Tubbs fire, and before we adopted what we call a housing action plan. We adopted that in 2016. It covered about 30 different ideas that we could come up with, initiatives that we wanted to try to really catch up on the housing need that we have. So what you see in orange is what the remaining need was, and we set incentives to try to achieve catch up 800 to 1,000 units per year for the next 5 years. But then Tubbs happened, and that complicated matters quite a bit, because now we have 3,000 units that need to be replaced as soon as possible to rebuild back our community. And in addition, we had set those housing goals to support our community, the whole of the community. So we did two immediate things because it required immediate action. Obviously, council set priority. This is number one. This is what we must address immediately and energetically. And we set up a physical, dedicated, resilient city permit center. It was on the city hall campus, but it we basically gave them a room like this. And we started hiring professional staff, professional services staff, and many of them were retired engineers or planners or architects or builders or secretaries that were familiar with our area, but and could really activate quickly. And the city staff was retained to be the overseer council with things that they needed to do their job. We also set up a virtual center, srcity.org/rebuild. We set it up as neat as we could and became our central clearinghouse for where you could find reliable, accurate, real-time information. Those two things really were critical. On the rebuild site, that's where we built up a resource library, not just a lot of links of resources, but real practical stuff. So we put energy into how-to guides. And obviously the first one we produced was, how do I begin this rebuilding journey? Almost immediately, the next one we had to produce is, how do I address smoke damage? You know, where do I start and how do I fit into the framework? And as time went on, in real time, we started adding to this library of how-to guides to address landscaping, water efficient landscaping, best practices, home hardening, and how to incorporate some of the other incentives I'll talk about in a second. In addition to these resources, we within 2 weeks, we adopted 2 ordinances. One was a rebuild area overlay. So we drew a line around the map of the burn area and said, okay, in this area it's going to be different. We're going to get all the obstacles out of the way that we can and really expedite the rebuild. It was fairly aggressive. We set it as one, it was mandated that these permits would always be prioritized over other permits. We waived impact fees, not just for the rebuild unit itself, but also for ADUs. We allowed for temporary housing to be on site. We allowed for the ADU to be constructed in advance, and it can be occupied first. And then in addition, we also adopted a rent gouging prohibition. Now the state was already leaning into that, and so our action was just local leadership to support that for the term of that state measure, that rents would be protected. And the protection was couldn't increase your rents more than 10% than the pre-fire condition. So that was the adoption. So did we know everything? No. And within 2 weeks, you're putting up a framework. So I have to say that over the last 5 years, we probably touched back to that the rebuild overlay at least 3 or 4 times. There were things we didn't understand. For example, we just didn't think of, once construction got going, all the staging and the temporary structures, temporary services that basically 3,000 homes across that area would need to be supported. We also we had to address the noise ordinance. Of course, we wanted to expedite, so we had to expand the noise ordinance, and so we were having to respond sort of every now and then. We would check in council, say what we learned from the community, and then propose how we might address that. The council would stand up and make those amendments. And we've extended the life. We set these up for 3-year temporary measures. We've already extended them. They will sunset at the end of this calendar year. And so we're looking at either do we still need them, or do we want to codify some of them since we've learned so much about. Lastly, I want to talk about the other ordinance that we stood up. It did take us a little bit longer, and this was the citywide resilient city measures. And one of the things that we realized going in is we can't possibly even support the rebuild in the rebuild area. So we needed to be much more flexible citywide. And so we extended that interest across the city, the temporary housing, the expeditious programs about accessory dwelling units. We had also lost hotels, and they didn't necessarily want to locate in the burn area. There was market conditions of already seen other hotels they wanted to locate elsewhere, but so we looked at expediting the replacement of hotels in other areas of the city. One of the other things that we learned was childcare was quite a big impact. We didn't realize that the workforce housing had really supported the community as much as it had, because a lot of childcare centers were within homes. And so we expedited in the permit process how to rebuild back that. And really this, when we came to an understanding is that we're not just rebuilding a rebuild area, you're rebuilding your community. So our strategy was use our recovering as one, like we're rebuilding that community. And speaking of community, we couldn't have done it without our community liaisons. Coffee Park is Coffee Strong is just one of them, but so many nonprofits, church groups, memberships, neighborhood liaisons. That's what helped us connect with the community. We couldn't have done it without them. People moved away. They're not going to need their email address, but they might give their old neighbor their, hey, yeah, keep me informed. I had to move out of the county. So that was really critical. And also they helped us populate the how-to guides. So in terms of the city-wide initiatives, I talked about some of them already. We also, for the permit streamlining, things that would normally require a major design review permit or a major use permit, we reduced the authority. So in our transit-oriented downtown areas, and this is where that housing action plan finally come into play. So we could cover both. We were already kind of trying to work this together so that we could support community through both of these measures. So how did we do? Not bad. It took a lot of effort, but as you can see here, the blue is the new construction, so outside of the burn area. And the gray is the rebuild. So starting in year one, at the end of year one in 2018, we were able to issue 1,400 building permits to support the rebuild. And while our goal had been 800 to 1,000 units per year, it definitely did a tamper on that, because there's only so much resource around to build housing, even if you have the most expeditious initiative. But we were able to keep some momentum, and that was really good. And then, as you can see, we were still looking at having a remaining need that was met. So where are we today with the rebuild? We're about 90% in terms of number of units. We've successfully attracted an additional 113 units to the area. And those are all considered moderate income, so that does help us with our affordability. And we have some more to go. There are the harder lots, there are some undeveloped lots. And it's been difficult to reach out to those owners. But we do from time to time, and at some point in this next year, we're going to address vacant lots that have become or could become a nuisance without further factors. So we continue to adapt and amend to address the situation as things come up. So these remaining vacant lots will have to address in another ordinance. The other thing that's come up is short-term rentals that sort of surprised us, but as we were going through the rebuild after that became a thing, and now so much of a thing is starting to really impact our ability to protect the existing housing stock that we were struggling to protect, and then is taking away from the new housing stock. So in addition to tons, we had glass, and again, we're continuing the momentum. As you can see, we are starting to find balance with building back our community. We didn't wait, we did it concurrently. It does take a hit for your capacity to look for other avenues, but it's essential to really build back and always have the eye on the prize. You're building back community so that everyone can enjoy living here, and as was stated earlier, your family members, your friends, and there's a place for you. So this is just a slide of some of our key lessons learned. Again, looking at it holistically. Also tapping into the social capital that emerges, not everyone has a role. The rebuild area, those folks need immediate attention, they need how-tos, they need help, they need lots of communication, good reliable information. There's also those that weren't directly impacted that want to help. And we need to find forums for them and a lot of different ways, but you know, in terms of looking at, you can enter into a downtown Pacific plan program. You're looking at a comp plan, there is social capacity to move these things along, and to keep the communication up with those that are really focused on the rebuild, but not to be excluded. In addition, you're not gonna do it all, we heard a lot about the regional state partnerships, grant writing and leveraging all that, that absolutely has to be done, and it should be, and don't be afraid to be bold. You're not gonna get it right, you didn't get it right, you had to amend it, extend it, twist it around. Eventually, you know, we're moving in the right direction. I think that's really key. And it takes a lot of leadership on the part of councils to be able to move, not knowing exactly what's gonna happen next year, but we don't. So you have to be okay with that. And always celebrate the successes. It takes so much passion and energy to make this successful in our hard days. So celebrate the good days and celebrate the wins that you have along the way.
So we're gonna be brief here and open up to you all. So let's go to the next slide. So we just wanted to summarize some of the key takeaways for you. In recovery and resiliency planning, this whole idea of balancing your focus on rebuilding and recovering, but also bringing about a conversation about longer term vision, priorities, integrating sustainability and resiliency principles into the planning process that you have going on, rather than inventing a whole new category. Building and maintaining local and regional capacity in disaster recovery. We have other partners in the area, that type of thing, and expanding funding support. For presentation on WUI best practices, with the recognition that grassland WUIs exist across the West, and so there are other examples to look at. And there's an opportunity you have to increase community fire adaptation, not just in the rebuilding process itself. And recommendations including comprehensive education, vegetation management, and construction ordinance. Housing diversity and affordability. The basic idea was one, understand what your need is. It's that socioeconomic data, and really start building on a base of understanding your community and its needs, and then pursuing a variety of strategies to implement that. But having a housing champion that can make that happen within the organizations, it's going to require sustained effort to be able to bring about this. Housing diversity and affordability. Community engagement is so important. I think we learned that in a lot of the presentations here. There is a well of social capital that's been built because of the concerns and problems that people are already faced. But you can also think about roles for people when you look citywide as well. Others in the community can step up and help think about this in a broader community perspective. You can strengthen and build upon existing kinds of communication mechanisms. So you have a emerging program with neighborhood liaisons. You have some social media platforms that are out there. So harnessing those kinds of things to build that capacity to communicate, and always addressing equity in terms of who's not at the table, who are we missing, who don't we understand in terms of their desires and goals, and bringing them into that process. So let's keep that slide up there if we can. And I think at this point, Lisa wanted to acknowledge the electeds who are with us today. And we'll make the transition after that to your questions. So think about what you want to hear more about.
So with us today for Louisville, we have City Manager Jeff Durbin, our Deputy City Manager Megan Davis, and then electeds. If you feel free to come join up front if you want, or hang out back there. But if you want to stand for Louisville. Mayor Maloney, Councilmember Dickinson, Councilmember Fahey, and then online we have Councilmember Lay and Councilmember Hamilton.
Hi, my elected officials here today are Mayor Lasis, if he wants to stand, he will be standing. Trustee Emily. For all the attendants, we stand up and point, thank you. And then we also have our town manager, Matt Magny, and our assistant town manager, Martin Pope. So. And again, I just want to thank the panel because you guys put in like 12, 14-hour days all week long. And this turned out really great. So thank you for your time and dedication. I appreciate it.
Great. Thanks so much. So I think we want to transition to the Q&A and discussion, and we're going to do that. We're going to do some, folks that are here in person, but we're also going to invite in the folks who've been remotely listening to the proceedings here. So Lisa's going to coordinate that. So ask your question. I'll look to see who has their hands up and wants to take a shot at an answer, or if you just have a comment, that's obviously welcome. So who wants to start? Yes, Mayor.
Thank you very much. I'm on behalf of the city of Louisville, I want to thank the advisory services panel. A special thank you.
I think we'll try to use the mic because then the people who are online can hear the Q&A. Thank you, Mayor. If you're speaking, just push the green button and make sure that's on, and then the microphone.
I guess this means I need to start over. On behalf of the city of Louisville, I want to thank the advisory services panel. I was one of the interviews on Wednesday. I think we were the 11th one. I was amazed by the attention you were applying at that time, considering you're the last of the interviews. So it's obviously you took this very seriously and you listened. I actually heard in the presentation some of my words, which was heartening. But I do want to recognize Victoria and Claire. You went through this personally, and you coming and spending time and lessons learned. That's something that's very, very important. So I'm just here to just thank you. I don't really have a comment beyond that. I do look forward to the reports. I made notes during the presentation. Obviously, we have a lot of challenges, and housing being one of those. So very much.
We have a Councilmember Lay online who's like here. That has go ahead, Councilmember Lay. We can hear you.
Sorry about that. Just echoed the mayor's comments about how appreciative we are of all the work and insight that you've brought. It's a very condensed and dense presentation that really gives us a nice framework for thinking about some of our challenges. One of the things I wanted to ask about has to do with the city of Santa Rosa. I'd be very interested in the staffing impact of these fires. I mean, you had multiple fires, but I'd be very interested in kind of how the staffing at the city level was affected by those fires, because that's something that we are certainly thinking about here too.
Thank you for the question. Well, many of our staff were directly impacted. They lost their homes and they still came to the emergency center. So it definitely brought the grit out in all of us to stand up and work with the community, see what we could do to help. Obviously, we're civil servants, and so that really became quite apparent. But we leaned into it. The sustained reality that it became every year, and in between those pandemic and the atmospheric rivers and all kinds of things, has been tough on our city staff. Most deputy level managers are still at the city. Those that were close to retirement did have fatigue and retired. And then we have, we refilled the city with lots of new, eager staff members who come in that actually knowing a lot about these things from other areas, bring a good fresh perspective, fresh culture. But trauma is not, civil servants are not immune to the trauma that you go through with these things. But it's very rewarding work.
Okay, one follow-up on that. Do you all in Santa Rosa have a strong, kind of, the term, I guess, is a strong city manager, government, form of government, or do you have a kind of strong council form of government?
We do have a strong city manager, but our council sets direction for us as an organization. We go into goal setting every year, and when we implement the vision, city manager has direct control over staff and how we implement the vision.
And I
Thanks.
think Victoria wanted to add on to this from the perspective of their staffing.
I do. Your staff is your greatest resource, and you need to take care of each other. And the town of Lyons had 14 dedicated staff the night of the flag. We eventually went up to 43 for the first 5 years. Almost triple for 5 years of recovery. There are only 3 of us that are still there, 9 years later. So this is very real. You need to acknowledge it. You need to give each other permission to take time off, to take breaks. And I do want to also mention that like our public works department, 5 of the 6 left after about 3 months. It's just pure overwhelmed fatigue and exhaustion. So please acknowledge that. Please take care of each other. Make sure you have mental health services available, as well as giving yourself physical breaks to get away from this. It will consume your life for years if you let it. So even in a very small town, we almost tripled for 5 years.
Great, so question, comment here, so please come up to the mic, I guess.
I just want to add my thanks to everybody that's sitting up there on the dais and all of the work that you put in and efforts to do this. And also to our staff that has been absolutely amazing. They've really accomplished a lot, and they've gotten a lot of these informational programs put together to give information to the public. My question is how at Santa Rosa, I will say, my brother-in-law lost his home in the Santa Rosa fire. So this is the second time going through this. How do you get the information to the public so that they know what resources are available for them and get them to show up to these events?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the biggest challenges after a major disaster, because displacement is immediate, right? You're evacuated, and so you're immediately displaced, and not everyone can come back and find a place to rent or to stage while they're waiting for the next step. So what we've learned is that it's challenging and that you have to adapt to the challenge. You have to find out how are those folks that were displaced connected to the community. So as I stated earlier, we can hold public workshops, but of course that's going to be for whether it's in person, and this is before we all got used to Zoom, even email blasts or websites and social media. That only gets to some of the community. It gets to the ones that are plugged in and ready to receive new information for one. So you really have to dig deeper. We worked with church groups because even if you're displaced, sometimes they had a link. We asked the community who remained if they knew their neighbors, if they could get in touch with them so we could connect with them, or if they would connect with them on our behalf. So we had to really meet them where they were, and they were all over.
Thank you.
We have a question online. Katie Dickinson.
Hi there. Yeah, so echoing the kudos to the team for a really wonderful and comprehensive set of recommendations and thoughts. And I appreciate the shout out for our Marshall Unified Research Survey, which is ongoing. So if you're a resident who's gotten an invitation for us, please, if you haven't already, please take our survey. It really is, we're learning a lot and sharing what we're learning through that survey with folks like this team. And you know, I think these fires are an opportunity or present an opportunity for us to learn not only to help this recovery, but also right for the folks that are going to go through similar things. So, so thanks for that. I have a question about, I thought that some of your specific recommendations, I was very interested to see specific recommendations around, you know, housing diversification and affordability. I think one thing that I've seen is that, you know, we'll have communities that where there's a lot of sort of general support for the concept of affordable housing. And then when a specific project is proposed, you know, folks may mobilize and be, you know, opposed to a specific project. It's not the right place. Concerns about density and traffic impacts and things like that. And then when you couple that with, you know, a community that is recovering from a disaster and traumatized and concerns about their needs being met, I think that's something that we've already seen in these communities, and those are you know, real concerns that need to be addressed. So I'm curious if some of the folks from Santa Rosa or Lyons or other places that have gone through this have some lessons learned in terms of how to balance those concerns and you know, think about a long game and how we, you know, think about you know, building a story of how this benefits the community specifically in the long run to have more diversified housing. I thought some of the ideas, you know, in terms of, you know, having multiple generations being able to live in a place and things like that were interesting. But yeah, curious to hear those thoughts.
Thanks for teeing up a question on housing, and we probably have both housers and examples to work from. Since Santa Clara was mentioned, 31, a little bit about how you build that support for housing, and then we'll talk to our housers and clients.
Yeah, that's a great question. Another challenge is, yeah, where and how do you place the new housing, and how do you address the community when you're looking at that? And I would say in the immediate aftermath, we went to the low hanging fruit areas of downtown, where it was well outside the urban areas. It was resilient in place. We didn't have all the tools set up, and when we got the tools set up, developers did come, but it was the low hanging fruit to start with downtown. As we started to fan out into other areas of the city, it became obviously more challenging to address the issues that you raised. But I think you hit it on the mark with diversity of housing. So if we were only supporting a housing type, like a affordable housing apartment, people are going to be upset. You really need to have a multifaceted approach. And so that we built strength in support because we didn't have just a one type of housing development that we were looking for increased units. We were looking at the missing middles, we were looking at the ADUs, we were looking at preservation of housing stock. So we set up things where you were protecting what was kind of either affordable by design and didn't have any protective measures and doing that. And I think that helped build community understanding that we do need to build housing, but how do you do it where it fits and it's not overwhelming? And yes, obviously you have site by site, site specific neighbor issues, and really just trying to mitigate issues that you normally would.
Let's go to Kimball.
I think that's a great question. You know, bouncing off of what was just stated about missing middle typology, I think what we heard in stakeholder interviews a couple of different times was that there was a large cohort of renter households that have left and were displaced and really aren't known where they went, if they'll be coming back, what obstacles those folks might be having. And I think as a community, if you were to step back and say, okay, the last 20 or 30% of the rebuild is really going to be the hard stuff where people were so underinsured that they don't have the option to liquidate their resources or come up with enough money to rebuild. Yet they want to return to their community. They're your neighbors that were there, but they can't afford to come back. How do you make space for those folks, either through lots that the city or the town can purchase? There's a lot of money out there right now to do things like that and rebuild and deed restrict and keep those homes in character of the neighborhoods, wherever those neighborhoods are. But bring back an affordable for sale or for rent option. And then there are some opportunities, not just in original town, but you know, in other places that you could consider lot splits, or instead of a single family home, having a duplex, or you know, an ADU with a single family home. That all adds housing supply, which is really important for folks that may not be able to build back where they were living. I do think it needs to come from the representation and the understanding that these are also your neighbors. And these are folks that are maybe even new since the fire, but are working in your community and providing a really critical piece of your community fabric. And valuing that and saying, you know, when I moved to town, I couldn't afford a $625,000 2-bedroom wee cottage either. You know, you want to be able to start up. It doesn't have to be so dramatic. There are a lot of places that you can add housing into the mix that meets your community where it is.
Great, Dan.
Good points, thank you. So building a more diverse housing mix here in Louisville and Superior was an issue before the fire. I mean, it's been a struggle with both communities. And the fire's only exacerbated the issues and both, particularly increasing the affordability issues, and as Kimball mentioned, really displacing a large portion of the renter population in this community. So the issue's only gotten worse. And I think going forward with, I mean, the NIMBY issues aren't going to go away, and the community opposition using fiscal impact analysis or using traffic issues as the red herring to turn down a particular project. I mean, those are going to continue to be challenges. But I do think going forward and that the planning process, particularly the housing plans that are being undertaken, really have to have a pretty comprehensive community education process associated with it. We're not going to convince everybody, but I think there needs to be some momentum in the right direction of trying to get a better balance in both of the communities that have suffered from these impacts.
And certainly housing was a key issue in Lyons and displacement.
So I want to offer a couple just practical things you might be able to do with the state. The town of Lyons, most of you probably don't even know this, 20% of our housing was affected. And because it was in the floodways, the houses couldn't go back there. So we had to get really creative. If you know Lyons, 3 sides of it are landlocked by Boulder County open space. So we are very limited in where we could put development. We actually looked at 16 different sites with the state and being to come up with something. We never found a site. We literally have 6 lots in town to be built and we will be built out. So there were no sites. And then all of a sudden, a gentleman who lived there years and years ago, who had platted 40 lots in 1973, came forward and said, I have this, but it's built on kind of a steep topography. And it is nestled right against one of the nicer neighborhoods that has HOA restrictions. Not where, you know, they were open armed about having affordable housing come in. So we went to the state. First of all, the developers that were interested in it were private sector affordable housing developers. And they said, we can't afford to do it here. 40 units is too small, first of all. We usually do hundreds of units, right? We didn't have that. 40 units. And then they said the topography is so challenging, this is going to be expensive. So we got a CDBG-DR grants for $4 million for the grading and the grading work that needed to happen on this site. And so that was the first thing that helped. The second thing is we went to the state and we said, we need a preference policy. That first and foremost will be people who were affected directly by the flood. They will have a preference so that they knew it was their neighbors coming back to the community. We had people that feared, you know, Boulder was going to bring busloads of homeless and just drop them off in Lyons and live there. Not so. So we had a preference policy. Then we said we want a second preference that anyone that currently lives and works in Lyons has the next preference. And they agreed to it. It takes work, it takes communication, it takes relationships, but they agreed. So I think the main thing is educate, educate, educate. Because you know what, when you look at the real facts and they got a list of who's moving back, it calmed it all down. And now I'd say we're down to just a couple people that still, like you said, will never like the idea of it. But we are so excited. We are opening 40 units in April, and there are people who have already lived in our neighborhoods and they want to come home still 9 years later. So I think it was a real success story. I welcome you all to come to the groundbreaking in April. We made it also, we worked with the developer to say, you have to match the materials and colors of this HOA. And they did. And it all worked. So I think we're one of those success stories, and we have affordable housing that's right up in a neighborhood that traditionally came out as saying, nope, not in my backyard. But that's what we did to try to make it work for all the parties, but it took a lot of education and giving facts to people so that they're armed with accurate information.
Great. So we're back to this room. Yes, Aaron.
I want to thank the panel on behalf of the town of Superior. Also thank staff for participating in the process and all the stakeholders for being interviewed, speaking to the issues. So I appreciate all of the time and effort that has gone into the discussion about the housing needs, and then also just the WUI analysis and being mindful also of how people are recovering the economic challenges that they have, the timing involved in it. But kind of thinking, you know, big picture, kind of zooming out from it and thinking like, okay, well, how does all of this protect us against the next fire, right? And you know, doing an overlay district, doing some WUI vegetation management ordinances, construction codes, not applicable to fire rebuilds, but to new housing, certainly is a good step forward, and you know, will harden those homes and the homes in those surrounding areas. But for a community like Superior that is largely built out, same thing with Louisville, largely built out, and where the threat, and then we've also got the, you know, just challenges with large HOAs. You know, we have the tools in our toolkit as a town that are actually going to be effective to help those communities with fencing considerations, with, you know, implementing these types of ordinances. So, you know, one question I have is, you know, what tools do we need as a local jurisdiction? Is this something that we need to be looking at for relief from the state in terms of common interest communities and the ordinance and the statutes that govern those communities? Do we need some sort of reform on the state level? And then secondarily, hardening communities and homes is one thing. Properly managing the fuel for the the next fire is a separate question altogether. And when we're talking about a multifaceted approach, like you talked about, Claire, you know, where should our focus really be? You know, I'm all for hardening a community, but what I'd really like to do is prevent the next fire from having the fuel to actually get to our community, so we don't need to harden it. You know, what should we be doing with the owners of the open space, Boulder County, city of Boulder, to prevent the next Marshall fire from having the fuel to actually get to our boundaries?
Right, as Molly written all over.
Well, there is, as you can imagine, not one single answer. Thank you, Mayor, by the way, for all of your feedback and input earlier this week. We did discuss open space. We did have excellent input from stakeholders this week on open space, what is moving forward. I think it goes back to a few things that we discussed as a group, that there are opportunities at all scales of the community. I would not bucket it into, if the open space does their part, the community doesn't have to do their part. It really is both, because no matter what the success of management is on open space, we should expect that there may be fires. And so the question is, what happens once, if and when those grasslands do catch on fire? So that is the connection to the hardened community. And I think hardened can be a harsh word. Hardened sounds like we're talking about concrete bunkers and no trees, and I don't think anyone wants to live in that kind of community, nor does anyone want to live in a community here in Colorado that doesn't have open space. So realistically, that's also where the voluntary actions on the comprehensive program, the comprehensive education program takes effect. We didn't get to spend a lot of time on the details, but those home assessment programs can go a long way. I was thinking an earlier question about how do you get people interested in this topic. I guarantee once the next fire starts on the Front Range, you are going to get calls from homeowners, you know, who are triggered again by the trauma of the Marshall Fire or other fires. And they will be asking, what can I do? What can I do? So being prepared for that moment when they call, here are the opportunities. It's not, as you pointed out, you can't do it all through regulation alone. We know that, and it will be incremental change, but I think that is a practical way to look at it. Our sense from working with the town last year was, realistically, you know, this isn't going to be an overnight change. And so even if ordinances, and we see this across other communities, even if ordinances are adopted, it takes time. Only other thing I'd say with open space is we heard a lot of amazing things that they're doing this week. And I really think it's important to recognize everyone is doing their best to see where the fire, why the fire occurred, how it spread. And there were multiple reasons why it spread and had home losses. It really wasn't just one area or one reason. And so I think, again, just going back to a comprehensive approach is the best practice approach we would recommend.
I'd throw in here, you pointed to, you know, limits of your authority or those kinds of things. You might bump up against some of those kinds of things. And I think that especially Superior as a statutory community, even for a home rule community, you can run into things that feel like barriers. But you also have your own lobby agenda and a political agenda and the attention of a lot of electeds at the state level and federal level at this moment. And so I would just advise, use that capital that you have politically wisely. Is there somebody phoning in?
We do have a written question online. This one's for you. First of all, thanking the panel for the important work and information, but looking forward for Louisville. What is Louisville doing to start building affordable transit-friendly housing on the Caslin? There's been no movement on this for years. I'm a Marshall Fire victim, and this is an important issue for me and my husband. I hope Jeff and other staff in attendance can answer. So my first response is the comprehensive plan, but.
Sure.
I guess I would echo that. The comprehensive plan is a tool to accomplish that. I think also the housing study and housing strategic plan, both of which are, you could talk about kickoff dates, but this summer. So we're working on contracts now and then moving down the road. It'll take us 4 or 5 months on the housing. 6 maybe, realistically. Comp plan probably won't wrap that up until early mid 2024, I guess. That also.
So get involved, see them come back, yes, so we have probably time for at least one more here, yes. Come on up.
Thanks, Caleb Dixon with Louisville. Just curious if, I really enjoyed the mitigation, adapting and suffering. And so, I think we're talking about how do we mitigate so there's not another fire, how do we adapt so that there's a fire, it's not as bad, and then this suffering, how do we make the suffering maybe less severe next time? I'm curious if either lines or scenarios that you guys were able to come up with any policies that you put in place that are sort of preemptive for the next crisis, that like, oh, when, because we're kind of planning for the next fire, but it might be a tornado. We're planning for the next fire, but it might be another, it's like, so did you put anything in place that says, oh, immediately when X happens, Y happens, and we're gonna do some of the things we did before, we're gonna do things we didn't do before, we're gonna pause this, we're gonna add this. Did you come up with any policies that are on the books now for the next crisis?
So that's probably gonna finish us up in terms of our appointed time. I know folks have an opportunity to stick around. We can chat offline as we finish this up. Let's do lines and then finish with Sarah and lines.
That is an excellent question, and probably we haven't necessarily put it into formal ordinances other than updating our floodplain ordinance. And of course, we have worked on we did our comprehensive plan this year, and we mitigation into that plan throughout it. Also, we had a recovery action plan that we made sure every chapter, every area had both a sustainability and a resilience component to it, so that we adopted that as a formal policy. Ordinance wise, I still work to be done on that. But I do know that one of our verbal policies, and I have shared this with others who asked, was I would highly recommend some form of a temporary building moratorium until you can get your staff organized, and paperwork in order, so that both the builders and the residents have a really clear path of what to expect, because that's really frustrating to them. It doesn't have to be very long, just a couple weeks to get your ducks.
That's pretty clear.
And I'll be quick. Really, it comes down to prevention, preparedness, communication. So we spent, while we were focusing on the rebuild, we had the brunt of it, the tubs. We participated in larger exercises like a community wildfire protection plan that that was led by state and regional agencies, and we participated in it, so that way we were making good use of our time. And we made, even between tubs and glass, just exponential changes in terms of communication and getting advancement warnings and notices out. If you can't predict all the events that can happen, but you do your best with what you can, and if weather patterns start to arise, be proactive about understanding what are the potentials, and then preparing your community to have their, to have your go bag, to be prepared. What can you do in the meantime? Make sure your family is safe. and then communicate effectively. We realized when stuff happened, we didn't even have evacuation zones. And we didn't really think it through with evacuation routes. And that's one thing that now every project, we think about evacuation routes, we think about communication. So for example, we just did this short-term rental ordinance. And it's in every conversation now, because even one of the stipulations for short-term rental is that you have to disclose if you're about your evacuation route. So it really does start threading into the lens of everything you do with policymaking community. And it does spread back into, you know, how everybody has a role, what you do, what you control, being prepared and having good communication is how we address it.
Darcy wants to know this.
I'm just gonna mention, there is a local example we learned about in our interviews, Title 19 in Boulder County. So they have, it's, you know, kind of getting right at what you were asking, Sarah, with your question in terms of, you know, based on if this happens, these are the things that would kind of go into effect immediately. The thing that struck me in reviewing that example is that it basically documented every disaster, and kind of what mechanism, you know, kind of what levers do we pull in these situations, what kind of foundation moving forward. So a good model for looking at.
Thank you, Darcy. So thank you for your attention, your questions. Thank you so much for what you have done and what you will be doing. And we really appreciated the opportunity to learn more about your communities and wish you all the best luck.